There's a story that lives in the darkest corners of the internet. A story about Soviet scientists, sleep deprivation, and 5 men who were turned into something no longer human. I've spent weeks chasing it, and what I found is more disturbing than the legend itself. The story first appeared in 2010 on a horror fiction website. It spread like wildfire, reposted, translated, narrated across YouTube. Most people who encountered it assumed it was a real historical document. It was not. But that's only the beginning of what makes this complicated. Because here's the thing. While the specific story is fiction, Soviet-era sleep deprivation research is not. The USSR ran documented experiments on human endurance. Some of those records are partially declassified, and some of what really happened is almost as strange as the myth. Let me start with the fictional version, because you need to understand exactly what the legend claims before we can pull it apart. The story begins in 1940s Soviet Russia. 5 political prisoners are sealed inside a chamber. The deal? Survive 30 days without sleep and earn your freedom. The prisoners are fed, monitored through 2-way mirrors, supplied with books, paper, running water. The researchers pump an experimental stimulant gas into the sealed chamber, a compound designed to eliminate the need for sleep entirely. For the first 2 weeks, everything seems controlled. Then something changes. On day 9, the first prisoner begins screaming. He runs the length of the chamber non-stop for 3 hours, then goes completely silent. Then the books start being torn, pages stuffed into the drains. The other prisoners stop speaking to each other entirely. By day 14, the researchers notice the breathing patterns have changed. The microphones pick up whispering. Not words, but a low, continuous noise. One prisoner has been standing at the observation window for 6 hours, just staring, not at the glass, through it, like he's watching something behind the researchers. On day 15, the researchers decide to turn off the gas. They announce through the intercom that the experiment is over. What happens next is the most cited part of the legend, and also the most obviously fictional. Because the prisoners refuse to leave, they beg to have the gas turned back on. The story then goes into graphic detail about the physical deterioration, prisoners who've torn flesh from their own bones, who've eaten parts of themselves to stay awake, whose wounds have healed abnormally, sealed shut with no sign of infection. These are the most visceral claims, and the ones with zero basis in any real document. When the chamber is finally opened, soldiers and researchers enter. 4 prisoners are still alive. The 5th is dead. What the story describes in those final pages, the way the remaining 4 react to the soldiers, I won't narrate it. Not because it's frightening. Because it reads like horror fiction. Because it is horror fiction. The story was written by a user named Orange Soda on a horror fiction forum called No Sleep in 2010. No Sleep has a simple community rule. Everything posted there is treated as real within the community. It's a creative writing exercise, a shared fiction pact. The story was never presented as journalism or history. But fiction has a way of becoming legend when enough people share it without the original context. By 2012, the post was circulating on forums without the No Sleep header. By 2014, it was on YouTube. By 2016, people were citing it on Reddit as a real historical event. The origin had been completely severed. Now, here's where the documentary gets genuinely interesting. Because while chasing this fictional story, I kept finding real threads. Soviet military research in the 1940s and 50s genuinely explored the outer limits of human endurance. And some of that research involved sleep. In 1953, the same year Stalin died, internal Soviet documents reference a facility designated in translated transcripts as Special Object 1473. What happened inside is not fully declassified. What we know is that it existed, it was funded by military science budgets, and it was connected to programs studying altered states of consciousness. Altered states of consciousness was Soviet scientific language for a cluster of experiments: sensory deprivation, pharmacological manipulation, extreme stress responses, and yes, prolonged wakefulness. These weren't fringe projects. They were funded through the same channels as early space medicine research. The man most associated with Soviet sleep research in declassified literature is not a monster from a horror story. He was a physiologist, a legitimate scientist named Nathaniel Kleitman. Except Kleitman was American. He's the man who discovered REM sleep, and the Soviets were watching his work very closely. In 1959, Kleitman famously observed himself in a cave for 32 days to study circadian rhythms isolated from natural light. That same year, and this is documented, the Soviet Academy of Sciences commissioned a series of studies on wakefulness extension using pharmacological compounds in human subjects. Those compounds included early amphetamine derivatives, modafinil precursors, and a class of stimulants whose long-term effects were not well understood at the time. The test subjects in these studies were not always volunteers. That detail is in the documents. It is not disputed. What the documents describe in the clinical language of Soviet military science is extended wakefulness periods of up to 11 days. Not 30 days, 11. And even 11 days is extraordinary. At that threshold, the human brain begins producing experiences indistinguishable from psychosis. Sleep deprivation at extreme levels produces hallucinations, paranoia, full breaks from reality. The brain, denied the chance to process and consolidate, begins generating its own experiences in real time. Some researchers described it as the brain dreaming while awake. That phrase appears in a 1961 Soviet study abstract. Now I want to address the most persistent question people ask about this story. Could a gas compound actually keep people awake indefinitely? The fictional story claims a stimulant gas was pumped into the chamber. The real-world answer is nuanced. Yes, airborne stimulant compounds exist. No, nothing like what the story describes has ever been documented. What does exist, and this is documented, is Soviet research into aerosol delivery of psychoactive compounds for crowd control and interrogation. That research was active from the 1950s through the 1980s. Some of it crossed lines that no ethical scientific body would sanction today. But none of it was about eliminating sleep. It was about control. The other question people always ask, why would Soviet scientists do this? And the real answer requires understanding the Cold War context. Both the Soviets and the Americans were in an arms race that included biology. MK-Ultra in the US, Project Neva in the USSR. The boundary between science and weapon was deliberately blurred. MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control program, ran from 1953 to 1973. It tested LSD, sleep deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy on unwitting subjects. The parallel Soviet programs were less documented, many records destroyed after Stalin's death. But historians now believe they were comparable in scope and in ethical violation. Here is a real document I want to tell you about. In 2005, a partially declassified report from the Russian Federal Archive Service referenced experiments conducted at a facility in the Ural region between 1948 and 1953. The experiments involved isolation, pharmacological stimulation, and extended observation periods. Subjects were described as military volunteers. The quotation marks around military volunteers are in the original translation. Whoever translated that document understood the implication. In Soviet military research from that era, volunteer status was frequently a designation given retroactively, applied to subjects who had no meaningful ability to refuse. The report describes maximum observed wakefulness periods of 264 hours, 11 days. After that threshold was reached, the document states, and I'm quoting the translated text directly, further observation was discontinued due to deterioration incompatible with continued data collection. That sentence is doing a great deal of work. Deterioration incompatible with continued data collection. Not incompatible with human life. Incompatible with data collection. That clinical distance, that bureaucratic framing of what was likely extreme human suffering, that's what makes real Soviet archive documents so disturbing. The horror isn't supernatural. It's administrative. Let me go further into the science, the real science, because understanding what sleep deprivation actually does to a human mind makes both the real history and the fictional legend more comprehensible. At 72 hours without sleep, 3 days, the brain begins its first full hallucinatory episodes. The first subjects to go 11 days without sleep in documented modern research, not Soviet but American in the 1960s, reported visions of cobwebs, of beings at the edge of their vision, of conversations they couldn't verify had happened. One subject was convinced a scientist was trying to poison him. That's not a horror story. That's a clinical case report. Now, Randy Gardner. You've heard of him. In 1964, a 17-year-old in San Diego stayed awake for 11 days and 24 minutes as a science fair experiment. He was monitored by a Stanford sleep researcher. He hallucinated. He had mood swings, paranoia, short-term memory loss. And then he slept for 14 hours and recovered. Almost completely. Gardner's case established something important. The human body can, in rare documented cases, survive extreme sleep deprivation without permanent damage if the conditions are relatively controlled. That's the optimistic version. The Soviet research suggests what happens when those conditions are not controlled. When the body is also stressed, malnourished, and chemically manipulated. Back to the legend for a moment. Because there's one specific detail in the fictional story that is based on a real phenomenon. The story describes a prisoner who hasn't slept in 15 days beginning to speak in a low, continuous monotone. Not words, just sound. That's called verbigeration. It's a real symptom of acute psychosis. Verbigeration, the continuous repetition of syllables or words with no communicative intent, appears in psychosis triggered by extreme sleep deprivation. The author of the Soviet sleep experiment story either researched this or encountered it in another medical context. Either way, it's one of the few details in the story that maps to documented medical reality. There are other real phenomena in the story, too. The account of wounds healing oddly is based on documented effects of extreme cortisol elevation, which does, in some cases, suppress the immune response and alter tissue repair. It's not supernatural. It's documented. The story wrapped real biology in supernatural context and called it history. I want to talk about a pattern I noticed while researching this. There is a particular type of story. History calls them creeping normality narratives, where a fictional account becomes accepted as real, not through a single dramatic hoax, but through a slow accumulation of uncritical repetitions. Each retelling strips a little more context. The Soviet sleep experiment story followed this pattern precisely. First, fiction with clear context on no sleep. Second, repost without the no sleep header, story alone, no attribution. Third, wiki-style entries that treat it as an oral tradition, removing the 2010 origin date. Fourth, YouTube narrations calling it the document. Fifth, Reddit threads citing multiple historical sources. The original author, writing as Orange Soda, has spoken about this in interviews. They created the story as horror fiction. They've watched it escape its original context with a mix of pride and discomfort. The story was good enough to be believed, which is its own kind of compliment, and its own kind of problem. Now I want to go somewhere most versions of this story don't go, because while the Soviet sleep experiment is fiction, there is a real case of a human being who genuinely could not sleep. Not a Soviet prisoner. A farmer from northern Italy. His name was Michel Jouvet. Actually, his patient's name is kept anonymous in the literature. The condition is called fatal familial insomnia. Fatal familial insomnia is a prion disease, related to Creutzfeldt-Jakob and BSE. It attacks the thalamus, the brain's sleep regulator. Sufferers stop sleeping completely. Not gradually, completely. They enter a state of permanent wakefulness, and within 18 months they are dead. There is no treatment. There is no recovery. The condition was identified in the 1980s by Italian neurologist Ignazio Reuter. The Venetian family that carries the prion mutation has had members die from it across multiple generations. Some knew it was coming. Some didn't. The documented descriptions of advanced FFI, the hallucinations, the breakdown of the self, surpass any horror fiction in clinical coldness. Why does this matter to our story? Because fatal familial insomnia is proof that sleep deprivation taken to its absolute extreme is not survivable. The body does not adapt. The brain does not find another way. Sleep is not a luxury the body eventually negotiates away. It is a structural requirement. The fiction got that part wrong. And importantly, So did the real Soviet research. The Soviet research into wakefulness extension via pharmacology assumed, based on early results, that the right compound could indefinitely delay the body's need for sleep while maintaining function. That assumption was wrong. What the compounds actually did was mask the deterioration while it accelerated invisibly. The subjects were collapsing from the inside before the external signs appeared. And here we reach the most chilling part of the real history, not the part that appears in horror stories, the part that appears in bureaucratic footnotes. There is a reference, in the 2005 partially declassified report, to a follow-up study proposed in 1954 that was never completed. The reason given for discontinuation: subject pool exhausted, subject pool exhausted. 2 words. In the context of a classified Soviet military research program from 1954, where subjects were military volunteers who couldn't refuse, the possible meanings of that phrase do not generate optimistic interpretations. This is the horror that's real, not screaming prisoners. Bureaucratic language erasing what happened to human beings. I want to pause here and acknowledge something about why I find this investigation so important. We live in an era where distinguishing real historical atrocity from internet legend is not an academic exercise. It's a survival skill. When fictional horror is accepted as history, real historical horror gets proportionally easier to dismiss as fiction. The Soviet sleep experiment as fiction is harmless, brilliant even, genuinely effective as horror writing. The problem is not the fiction. The problem is the claim of facthood, because that claim displaces real history, real victims, real documents, real programs that deserve to be remembered and understood for what they actually were. Let me tell you about a real sleep experiment that happened. One that received almost no attention because it wasn't dramatic enough for the internet. In 1986, a Soviet research team at the Institute of Higher Nervous Activity published a study on controlled sleep deprivation over a 7-day period using 12 human subjects. The study tracked cognitive decline, hormonal disruption, immune suppression, and psychological deterioration over the 7 days. The findings were presented at a scientific conference in East Berlin in 1987. They were not classified. They were not sensational. They were thorough, careful science. And they established benchmarks for human cognitive collapse under sleep deprivation that are still referenced today. That study exists. It is real. It is publicly available through Cold War science archives. Nobody made a YouTube video about it. Nobody posted it on Reddit. It's dry. It's technical. It doesn't involve sealed chambers or madness. It involves careful observation of human beings slowly deteriorating under controlled conditions, which is somehow both less dramatic and more disturbing. There's one more real document I want to tell you about. In 1992, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a journalist named Yevgenia Albats gained access to KGB archives. In her resulting book, a genuine piece of investigative journalism, she documented programs of psychological experimentation conducted under Soviet authority. Albats documented instances of forced psychiatric commitment. The Serbsky Center in Moscow diagnosing political dissidents with sluggish schizophrenia, a diagnosis invented specifically to justify indefinite institutionalization. Some of those patients were subjected to pharmacological experiments without consent. That history is documented. It happened. It requires no supernatural embellishment, so here is what I've concluded after all of this research. The Soviet sleep experiment is a 2010 horror story written by a skilled fiction author. It contains some details drawn from real medical phenomena, verbigeration, cortisol effects, psychosis symptoms, but its central premise and events are entirely fabricated. The gas chamber, the 30 days, the physical impossibilities, all fiction. But and this matters enormously, the USSR did conduct sleep deprivation experiments on human subjects. The USSR did run pharmacological programs without ethical consent. The USSR did use psychology as a weapon against its own citizens. These things happened. They are documented. And they are more disturbing than the fiction, because they are real, and the people they happened to were real. The fictional story actually does something harmful to that real history. It makes it easier for people to dismiss. When someone hears Soviet sleep experiment and then discovers the specific story is fiction, they walk away thinking the whole thing was made up. They don't go looking for the 2005 declassified report. They don't find the 1986 study. They don't read Allbats. This is the real cost of false history. It doesn't just mislead, it inoculates. Once you've been fooled once, you become skeptical of everything, and that skepticism, which should be a protective mechanism, becomes a tool that allows real documented atrocity to be dismissed alongside the fiction. The legend becomes armor for the truth. So what do I want you to do with all of this? I want you to read the fiction as fiction, and appreciate it as such. It's genuinely skillful horror writing, and I want you to read the real history as real. Follow the threads I've outlined here. Look for the 2005 Federal Archive Service report. Look for the 1986 Institute study. Find Allbats' book. The real history of Soviet human experimentation is dark enough. It doesn't need embellishment. It needs attention. And in an era where the most dramatic version of any story gets the most shares, the most views, the most reach, there is genuine value in slowing down to ask, where did this actually come from? Who wrote this? What are the primary sources? Those questions, and where did this come from, who wrote it, what are the primary sources, are the same questions historians ask, the same questions investigative journalists ask, the same questions any person navigating a world of mixed information needs to ask. They're not complicated questions, they just require you to pause before sharing. The Soviet sleep experiment did not happen, not the way the story tells it. But Soviet researchers did test the limits of human consciousness on unwilling subjects. And those people, the ones the documents describe as military volunteers, with subject pool exhausted, deserve something more than to be overshadowed by a horror story. They deserve the truth. Whatever it actually was,